Veteran approaches a retired war dog. What happens next will break your heart. Before the story begins, if you like our channel, subscribe to help us reach 1,000 subscribers. And now we invite you to enjoy a story with an unexpected ending. John walked alone through the park as he did every afternoon. It was a quiet routine, a way to fend off the loneliness that had weighed on him since returning from military service. The overcast sky mirrored his mood, and the crunch of dry leaves beneath. His boots was the only sound breaking the silence around him. As he followed a less traveled path, something caught his attention. In the distance, a sturdy dog with brown fur speckled with black sat beside a younger man. The dog looked restless, as if searching for something or someone. The vest the dog wore bore the words, "Retired War Dog," in worn, clear letters. John hesitated, his gaze fixed on the animal. Something about the dog's eyes made him stop. They held stories, a heaviness of battles and memories, much like his own. Before he realized it, John had taken a few steps toward the dog. The man holding the leash noticed and offered a polite smile. "He's Max," the man said. "He was a patrol dog in the military, just retired recently." John nodded but couldn't respond right away. His attention was locked on Max, who was now looking back at him. It was as if the dog recognized him or sensed something words couldn't express. "He seems special," John finally said, his voice quieter than he intended. The man gave a small smile and released the leash. "He likes people who understand what it's like to be there." John wasn't expecting it, but Max began walking toward him, each step deliberate, as if the dog were assessing him. When Max stopped in front of him, John crouched down, keeping his eyes level with the dog's. "Hey there, buddy," John murmured, extending a hand. Max slowly lowered his head and, to John's surprise, rested it on his shoulder, as if seeking comfort. John closed his eyes for a moment, feeling a lump rise in his throat. Something profound and unexplainable had just happened. Max's owner watched the scene with a curious expression. "Looks like he likes you." But it was more than that. Deep down, John knew this encounter held a greater meaning. His heart raced, and for a moment, the park around him seemed to fade away. As John gently stroked Max's fur, he had no idea that this meeting was only the beginning of a revelation that would change everything. What was it about Max's past that felt so familiar to John? As John and Max locked eyes, Ryan began to share Max's story. Ryan, the dog's owner, seemed to sense John's genuine interest and the unexpected bond forming between him and Max. "Max was trained for search and patrol missions in war zones," Ryan began. "He served for 5 years alongside military teams in places no one else dared to go." John remained silent, absorbing every word. "He wasn't just an alert dog. You know," Ryan continued, "he saved lives. Max could detect explosives buried in the ground, locate injured soldiers, and he was there to provide comfort in the darkest moments." Ryan's eyes glistened briefly, as though reliving a memory. "There was this one mission," Ryan said, his voice steady but tinged with emotion. "The vehicle Max's team was in got hit. He was trapped in the wreckage for hours but didn't stop barking until the rescue team found them. He saved everyone on that mission." John swallowed hard, feeling a tightness in his chest. He understood all too well the kind of pain Ryan was describing. Max watched John intently, as if he knew his story was being shared. "Why was he retired?" John asked, trying to keep his voice steady. Ryan sighed. "After years of service, Max started showing signs of wear. He became restless at night, whining for no apparent reason. The vet said it was a form of post-traumatic stress, similar to what soldiers experience. So they decided it was time for him to retire." John looked at Max with newfound understanding. This wasn't just a dog. He was a veteran like him, someone who had endured the same intensity of pain, fear, and sacrifice. "He doesn't trust people easily," Ryan added, watching how Max held his gaze on John. "But it seems like he feels something different with you." John gently stroked Max's head again, noticing the strength in the dog's muscles, but also the vulnerability only someone who had been through the same experiences could recognize. In that moment, John had an odd feeling, almost as if Max were trying to communicate something, not with words, but with his presence. The narrative shifts to a montage of Max's time in the military. A young soldier trains him with a firm yet affectionate approach. Max learns to track enemies, carry supplies through harsh terrains, and respond to commands that could mean the difference between life and death. One moment stands out, a dark night in a war-torn village. Amid the rubble, Max discovers a critically injured soldier. The dog refuses to leave his side until the rescue team arrives. The soldier places a trembling hand on Max's head, whispering, "You're my last hope, buddy." As John and Ryan continue talking, something about Max triggers a memory from John's own time in the war. Could it be a coincidence? Or is there something deeper that connects the veteran and the dog? Max grew increasingly comfortable by John's side. The dog, usually reserved and distant with strangers, rested his head on the veteran's knee as if reconnecting with an old friend. Ryan, intrigued, watched silently, sensing that something extraordinary was unfolding. John ran his hand over Max's short fur, feeling the small scars scattered across the dog's body, silent markers of a past the dog couldn't vocalize, but that spoke volumes nonetheless. "He must have seen things none of us would ever want to remember," John said, more to himself than to Ryan. Ryan nodded. "You're right. He's strong, but he carries the weight of everything he's been through. Sometimes when he sleeps, Max has nightmares. He wakes up panting like he's back in the war." Those words echoed in John's mind. He too had nights like that, nights where vivid images of war jolted him awake. He knew what it felt like to carry the weight of the past. Perhaps that was why he felt such a strong connection to Max. Then, something unexpected happened. As John stroked Max, he noticed a subtle movement. The dog was watching him closely, tilting his head in a way that felt too familiar. John blinked, a buried memory beginning to surface. Suddenly, John was mentally transported back to the battlefield years ago. He was on a dangerous mission, leading a small team through an abandoned village. The silence was deafening, the kind of silence that screamed danger. Out of nowhere, a dog appeared, a sturdy shepherd, guiding the soldiers away from a minefield. It was Max, younger, more agile, his eyes filled with determination. John remembered the overwhelming relief he'd felt seeing the dog. Amid the chaos, Max had saved his team, leading them to safety. John had never learned the dog's name, but had always remembered the animal as a true hero. The memory was vivid now. John raised his head, looking at Ryan. "This dog, he served in the Middle East, didn't he?" John asked, his voice trembling with emotion. Ryan furrowed his brow, startled by the question. "Yes, he served there for years. How do you know that?" John looked at Max, his heart racing. "Because I was there. He saved my life." Ryan's face mirrored John's shock. He glanced at Max, then back at John, trying to process what he was hearing. "Are you sure?" Ryan asked, his voice barely above a whisper. John nodded, tears forming in his eyes. "I'll never forget that day. He wasn't just a dog on that mission. He was an angel." In that moment, Max reacted in an unexpected way. He lifted his head and gazed at John with an expression that seemed to hold recognition. Then he did something that left both men speechless. He placed a paw on John's hand and let out a low sound, a mix of a whimper and a sigh, something between sorrow and solace. John remained still, but inside he was overwhelmed with emotions. He had spent so many years believing that dog was just a distant memory. Now, here he was, older, more worn, but just as heroic as ever. "I can't believe this," Ryan murmured. John smiled faintly, his eyes still glistening with tears. "He remembers. I'm sure of it." At that moment, John realized their reunion wasn't just a coincidence. But what would this reconnection mean for both of them? Could Max help John find peace with his own past? And what did the future hold for this bond that seemed destined to last forever? As silence enveloped John, Ryan, and Max, the emotions in the air felt almost tangible. John couldn't take his eyes off Max, and the dog returned the gaze with an intensity that words could never capture. There was a connection, a communication that transcended language. Ryan, still processing what he had just heard, decided to seek more concrete answers. "John, do you really think it was Max who saved you and your team on that mission? He's been in multiple combat zones, but maybe we can confirm it." Ryan pulled out his phone and began searching through Max's service records, which he had saved for safekeeping. Meanwhile, John knelt before the dog, a mix of reverence and emotion in his expression. "Do you remember me, buddy?" John murmured, his voice trembling. "I never got the chance to thank you." Max didn't respond with words, but he lowered his head and licked John's hand, a gesture that carried more meaning than any spoken response ever could. Ryan, now scanning through the records, suddenly froze, his heart racing. "John, you were part of Operation Horizon, right?" he asked, looking up. John nodded slowly. "Yeah, that was the mission." "Why?" Ryan turned the phone toward him, revealing the confirmation. Max had been part of the K9 unit deployed for that operation. A photo of a younger Max, his eyes sharp and determined, accompanied the record. "It's him," John whispered, his voice barely audible. "It's really him." Memories began to flood back, and John spoke as if unearthing long-buried thoughts. "It was an extraction mission. The area was riddled with landmines. We lost contact with the base and were surrounded with no idea which way to go. Then this guy," he glanced at Max, tears glistening in his eyes, "showed up. He looked so determined, like he knew we were in trouble." John paused, wiping his face with his hand. Max led the team down a safe path. He'd sniff the air, stop every few meters, like he was protecting us. In the end, we made it out. But not everyone survived that day. It was one of the hardest days of my life, and I always wondered what happened to that dog. Ryan listened intently, his expression heavy with emotion. "Now we know," Ryan said softly. "He was transferred to another unit after that mission. But look at this. He found his way back to you." John let out a small laugh, thick with emotion. "Who would have thought fate would bring us together again all these years later?" As Ryan and John continued talking, Max began to show signs of distress. He paced in circles, let out low whimpers, and glanced at John with a mix of urgency and unease. "Is he okay?" John asked, concern etched on his face. Ryan sighed. "He has anxiety attacks sometimes, especially when something triggers memories of the past. I think this reunion is affecting him too." John crouched closer to Max, gently stroking his fur. "Hey, buddy. It's okay now. You've done your part. You saved so many lives." Hearing those words, Max slowly began to calm, as if John's voice carried a soothing balm for his unseen wounds. As John continued to comfort him, he noticed something he hadn't realized before. Max wasn't just a hero, he was a reflection of John's own journey. Both had endured battles that left them scarred, and both carried the weight of those experiences. It was as if this reunion wasn't just a coincidence, but a chance for redemption for both of them. Now that the past had been uncovered, John started to feel that he and Max could help each other heal from the wounds of war. But were they ready for this new journey together? And what else might fate have in store for this improbable bond? In the days following the park encounter, John couldn't stop thinking about Max. The dog seemed to occupy his thoughts constantly, as if fate were urging him to take action. Meanwhile, Max showed signs of attachment to John as well. Whenever Ryan brought him back to the park, Max appeared restless, sniffing the air as though searching for the veteran. Finally, Ryan decided to have a conversation with John. "Look, John," Ryan began, "I've been thinking a lot since that day. Max needs someone who truly understands what he's been through. He likes you. Anyone can see that. And honestly, I think you need him too." John was silent for a moment, caught off guard by the offer. "You're saying I could keep him?" he asked hesitantly, as if the hope was too big to believe. Ryan smiled. "I think you two share something special, and Max deserves a home where he can feel understood." When Ryan brought Max to John's home, the dog seemed to understand that something significant was happening. He walked to John's door with steady steps, but when he looked up at the veteran, his tail began to wag slowly, as if giving his own green light. John couldn't hold back his tears. Kneeling down, he welcomed Max with an embrace that carried all the unspoken emotions of the past years: gratitude, pain, and above all, hope. "Welcome home, buddy," John said, stroking Max's head. The months that followed were transformative for both of them. Max seemed to find peace in the simplicity of life with John. They walked in the park every morning, visited the small town for supplies, and spent afternoons in the backyard, where John had set up a special space just for Max. At night, Max still had his nightmares, but John was there to comfort him. Whenever the dog woke up restless, John would sit beside him and say, "It's okay, buddy. You're safe now." Oddly enough, John began sleeping better too. The painful memories of war that used to haunt him were quieter now. Max's presence gave him a sense of purpose, silencing the echoes of the past. One sunny morning, during their park walk, John came across a group of young veterans holding a community gathering. They were sharing stories and experiences to help one another overcome the challenges of transitioning back to civilian life. "You should join us," one of the veterans said, noticing John's hesitation. John looked at Max, who seemed to nod his approval with a slight tilt of his head. John smiled and agreed. In the months that followed, John became an active member of the group. He started sharing his story, including the profound impact Max had on his life. Max became something of a mascot for the group, offering quiet comfort to veterans still struggling to find meaning in their own journeys. John's encounter with Max wasn't just a coincidence, it was a lesson in redemption, healing, and the power of unexpected connections. Both carried scars, visible and invisible, but together they found a way forward. At the end of the day, as the sun set and Max rested beside him in the backyard, John reflected on the path that had brought them together. "I guess we saved each other, didn't we, buddy?" he said, smiling as he ran his hand through Max's fur. The dog lifted his head for a moment, as if he understood perfectly, then lay back down, completely at peace. John and Max's journey is a reminder that healing can come in the most unexpected forms. Sometimes the greatest saviors in our lives don't speak. They act in ways that touch our very souls. And you? Have you ever found an unexpected connection that changed your life? Share in the comments how this story touched your heart.